I've got a YouTube channel and I like to talk about watches. Lately, I've been thinking about social media more broadly and the effect it's having on watch enthusiasm. There are a ton of positives, but there are some things that I think are less than great and not good for the long-term health of this hobby or watch obsession. I've got some controversial statements, but I'm going to make my case and hopefully we can have a civil conversation about this. This might be my Jerry Maguire mission statement kind of moment, but hopefully it's going to be interesting. Let's dive in. Why talk about this? The reason I make such a bold statement isn't just for clicks. It's because I do think the statement has merit. I love watches, I love the industry, I love talking about watches, but across the board there are some things that are good, but also some things that are not great and that are not healthy for our hobby. Now, if you like how I talk about things, then consider subscribing to my channel. It's the best way for me to know whether I'm hitting the mark in terms of what you guys are interested in. So click subscribe and hit the notification bell as well if you think the content is worth your time. Thanks a ton. Go to Hodinkee, A Blog to Watch, Adrian Barker, go pretty much anywhere. And a vast majority of reviewers will, to varying degrees, go through specifications of a watch. Lug widths, lug to lugs, movement accuracy, power reserve, quick adjust bracelets, certifications, all that kind of stuff. All of these things are interesting and relevant to shine a light on when talking about a watch, especially when it's a review that potentially could give a person a valuable insight that could inform their decision as to whether or not they want to buy a watch. To me, there's no doubt that the advent of people like Adrian and Britt and Teddy has added something to the watch ecosystem that wasn't there to the same extent before. If you go back 10 or 15 or 20 years, most buyers only had the company's word for it whether or not a watch was good. The transparency into the industry was much more limited than it was today, and people didn't get or ask for specs in the same way that they do today. This has led to a lot of positives. Today, you can very quickly get an assessment of whether the specs of a movement in a new Tudor model are acceptable compared to what you can get from another brand at a comparable price. You know fairly quickly and easily whether the bracelet supplied with that new Zenith you bought does or doesn't have the practical features that are comparable to what you can get in a similarly priced Rolex or Omega or Jaeger Ultra. It's much harder for Bremont to pass off a Sellita movement in a 904L steel case as a value option, because it's going to be called out. There's so many enthusiasts out there that want to share their thoughts, and many of them are, despite opinions to the contrary, entirely unaffected by the brands, much to the annoyance of some of those brands. Now, tech brands like Intel, AMD, Nvidia, Asus have been used to this kind of transparency for a long time, and it's in more or less accepted part of the tech ecosystem that you are accountable for your statements, and your statements of a 5070 being as fast as a 4090 are going to be tested and validated. That's a good thing. But the luxury watch brands have had a hard time with this increased accountability. First of all, I think they have a hard time with it because they don't feel a luxury product should be judged in such a technical manner. I think it frustrates them that it peels away some of the marketing BS and branding smoke and mirrors that they really don't want pulled back. They don't like it when someone points out that a stamped dial on a 6007G might look good, but is still lazy and cost-cutting from a brand that should, at that price point, be concerned with, true craft. Secondly, they just can't cut corners. Getting transparency into when a spec really is a good spec and when it isn't is great. All of this is good, but everything has a downside, and this does too. I see it in the comments. I hear it in conversations with a lot of enthusiasts. Too many people are boiling a watch down to the specs. To some extent, it's becoming this mathematical, objective, analytical quantification orientation to some watches that just really isn't that good for the hobby. My Zenith A384 that I bought has a ladder bracelet with a push pin adjustment system. It's got no on the fly, and I don't care, but I've seen the comments. To some, it's a completely unbuyable watch because of the outdated bracelet, and I think it misses the point. This is a gorgeous watch. You might think it's too expensive, but this one spec isn't and shouldn't be the deal breaker for what is an overall watch experience. I'm also constantly surprised by comments of people that literally write that they refuse to buy a watch that isn't METAS certified. And for sure, METAS is the best certification, but because a Luc Chopard XPS officer isn't certified to handle 15,000 Gauss, you simply won't buy it. You'll disregard any Longines, you'll disregard any Jaeger Ultra because of a specification. I think that's a shame. Specs are important, absolutely. They're also a cost driver. When a manufacturer at any price point puts together a watch, the final price is, of course, a function of whatever markup they think they can give the product, but it does start somewhere with the cost of the product. If brands are forced to invest everything in accuracy and power reserve and depth rating, the headroom to invest in creativity and design and originality is going to be less. The act of drawing a new watch costs money also, and if we as consumers just scream more specs, we're not always going to get everything. We do risk brands skimping on the creative expression to meet our demands on specs. That's going to lead to a whole lot of really well spec'd, but ultimately repetitive and very similar dive watches, and that's going to be boring. I spoke about this in another video as well. A watch is the sum of the manufacturing of the body, the manufacturing of the movement, the creativity, the identity, and the craft. And boiling it down to the manufacturing and the specs is 2 out of 5. It leaves so much else out of the equation. So much that is hugely important to the experience. China. Transparency is a thing. Most people know by now that a lot of brands get parts and components for their watches from somewhere other than Germany or Switzerland. Thailand is apparently a hub for dials. India is a hub for watch hands. And China, they make great cases. There are a few brands that do everything themselves, and it's only their raw materials that get imported. And believe it or not, there aren't a lot of iron and gold deposits within the borders of Switzerland, but a majority of brands get something from somewhere else. This, to a lot of people, is a bad thing. Swiss made in their minds should mean truly Swiss made, and it doesn't. The same goes for Germany or made in the USA. Just go back a couple of years when you recall the flack that Shinola got for calling their watches Detroit built when they clearly weren't. Honesty in marketing is important. I do think there has been an overly murky aspect to the concept of Swiss made. This storytelling about how some girl in lederhosen polished the watch case with her bare hands against the soft hide of a live cow is disingenuous at best. It's perfectly cool that this has been called out and exposed for the marketing that it is to a large part. But the counterpoint is, so what if parts of the watch come from China or India or Thailand? An iPhone is made in China. It's not worse as a result. There's definitely storytelling, and brands want you to pay a premium for that storytelling. But the fact that some dial comes from Thailand or is just sourced from some other Swiss vendor does not make the dial any less impressive. This notion that all companies in the watch industry should build everything themselves in their own factories, from design to build to packing to shipping, is unrealistic and not a standard we hold pretty much any other type of product accountable to. The Thailand dial is not less stunning because it's from Thailand. Things in your watch likely don't all come from Switzerland or Germany, and that isn't by definition a bad thing. And I do feel that it sometimes is the case that that is what it gets boiled down to. I'm not done with China. Because of social media, because of some of the coverage of different brands, and because of the fact that some parts come from China, it's become more and more easy to conflate anything that comes out of Switzerland as not superior to anything from China. It's just more expensive. It's the story of how, Asian brands polishing is just as good as Rolex's, so why buy a Rolex? And it's just reductive reasoning, and it's born by social media, and it's wrong. In my Q&A video a couple of weeks back, I spoke about, these 4 bracelets that I had, shown to me. All of them had their origins from the same town in China, but one was the stock Chinese bracelet. One was an almost identical bracelet that just had Swiss branding. But then there was the bracelet where the Swiss manufacturer, through quality control and strict supplier standards, got that bracelet to a whole other level. And then there was the bracelet, proof of concept at least, which was so essentially customized that it was a completely different product. What you think is a reasonable price for a watch is personal. I personally find it hard to come up with some objective definition of what is a good value watch. But there are things that happen at British brands and German brands and Swiss brands that make those stock parts and components better than what flies out of that Chinese factory. This social media reduction that Switzerland is just a middle step that makes things more expensive through branding and nothing else is wrong, and it's hurting the industry. Now, if you're one of those people that just have the opinion that, I hate the Swiss watch industry, they're overpriced, they can burn to the ground, and I'll get all my watches from China, well, nothing that I say in this video is going to change your mind. I mean, you're set, that's what your belief set is. But for the rest of you, Swiss, German, British, French, and a whole lot of other brands do invest time and creativity and innovation, both in terms of design and technical characteristics, that give us more exciting, interesting, and appealing products. Some of them are better than others. Some of them want us to pay a premium for their name as well. And yes, there are Chinese brands that are doing super interesting things as well. It's absolutely the case. There's zero denying that. But if we just chase the cheap factory watch, it's a race to the bottom. The more we remove the romance from the product, the more pointless this hobby becomes. I mean, basically what I'm saying is maybe be okay with the fact that not knowing what goes into the hot dogs is a good thing, because you might never appreciate a good hot dog ever again if you knew. Go back 30 years and, watch marketing was simple. Patek told you that their watches were for people with generational wealth. Rolex was for successful people, and all other brands just had some movie stars or race car drivers wearing their watches. This basically hasn't changed much at all. Not a lot of brands have really come up with a better idea. Audemars Piguet basically just had the revolutionary idea to embrace rappers and basketball players. And at the time, that was markedly insane. But it was just, the same template. You find a celebrity and you have them flaunt your product. We want those products that some famous people wear. That's always been the case, and it's not changing. But I do think that social media is contributing negatively to this in some ways. Today, we instantly know that Mark Zuckerberg bought basically the entire FP Journe catalog. He just went out and just swiped his MasterCard and bought them all. We know that Mark Wahlberg got himself a Cubitus. Nico and company, they will make fun of YouTubers who own Richard Mille and Jacob & Co. watches. It's fun. It's all with the intent to entertain, but it emphasizes the consumerist component of watches. It's about having, consuming, owning, and flaunting. It's very rarely about enjoying, savoring, or experiencing. An Audemars Piguet Royal Oak is a stunner of a watch, and it's an experience to wear. But when we are inundated with videos about who wears it and how much it costs, all the fun, all the experience is forgotten. I mean, just as a heretic thought, maybe Richard Mille's are actually good, and we've just been completely jaded because of the focus on who buys them. It's just a thought. I've said it before, I've also done market videos. I don't apologize for that, because as with everything else I'm talking about, there are positives to all of these things. Talking about specs has led to something positive, better spec'd watches, but it also has a dark side. It's also objectively good to know what you should be paying for a pre-owned Rolex or Omega, and it's objectively good that it's easier to find out. Transparency is a plus for the consumer. Being able to assess whether a retail price is in some way reasonable by looking at the resale price is good to know. We need those videos and we need those articles. Those articles have value. It's a positive. But you know what isn't? Reducing a watch's value to an individual to some sort of monetary metric. I bought a Zenith A384. And you know what somebody wrote in the comments? Hopefully I didn't pay retail because it's worth nothing now. That's what somebody wrote. My mental response was, so what? I bought it because it was beautiful. I'm sure that if I had told you guys that I paid retail, people would question my intelligence as an individual. Grey market dealers especially are guilty of this. They'll happily frame themselves as Robin Hoods of the watch world, saving you money on that Seamaster 300M so you don't get stiffed by the Omega man. And they're also making you richer when they get you a Daytona at only 35% above retail. Every time Nico and others, who I quite enjoy by the way, does one of his, cha-ching videos and states how much a watch is worth, I just kind of die a little bit inside. Transparency is good, but talking constantly about prices reduces the point of the hobby. The goodness of a watch isn't a function of its monetary value. The Mona Lisa isn't good because it's expensive. It's expensive because it's good. Let's get a couple of statements out of the way. Rolex is God tier. Rolex is for posers. Rolex buyers are idiots. Christopher Ward is an overpriced homage brand. Christopher Ward is an exceptional value brand. Everything Swiss is overpriced. Chinese watches are slave labor, government subsidized thefts of intellectual property. YouTubers are useless shills. YouTubers are fun and useful. Some people like some things and dislike other things. That's the way it should be. Personally, I won't apologize for liking Christopher Ward, and I will speak about Studio Underdog however much I want, and no amount of days since Studio Underdog was last mentioned comments are going to make a difference. My likes and my opinions are mine. But there's a difference between liking Omega more than Rolex versus loving Omega and hating everything Rolex stands for. And this might be a broader societal thing, but a lot of social media becomes super oppositional, and it doesn't have to be. You don't have to like Richard Mille, but do we really have to hate on the brand and every single person that owns one? To me, it's the difference between supporting a football team and hoping they win versus putting on a balaclava and going to the neighboring town to beat the skulls in of the rival town's team's supporters. I mean, why? Why can't we love what we love without hating on those that love something else? Rolex owners aren't idiots, and Chinese watch owners are not deluded poors. We like something and other things we don't. Social media sometimes forces us to take a position and draw hard lines where there don't need to be hard lines. I have to preface this piece, lower prices and good value is important to me. And don't get me wrong, it's key. Now, why do I have to say that? Well, it's because the good thing about social media and access to information is that the quality of watches has massively increased in recent years. I mean, you just go to those sites that talk about cheap Asian brands. Those brands aren't perfect, but the build quality of a San Martin for $300 or $400 or $500 is objectively incredibly good. I will always stand by that position. As a package, they're not as good as Tudors or Omegas or Rolexes, but they're good. You can also have your opinions of Christopher Ward and other value brands, but I think it's an incontrovertible fact that build quality of brands like them is just higher overall than it was 10 years ago. Especially that manufacturing quality is just super high. Brands like Frédéric Constant that have, made perpetual calendar movements available at sub $20,000 pricing is a huge achievement. And that's down to the ambition of nimble and agile and largely independent brands in social media. I really believe it's the case. I don't think the quality of Longines or Raider or Tudor would be as high if it wasn't for independence and social media pushing for improvement. But, and this is where that prefacing statement comes into play, sometimes, just sometimes, a little too much about watches is being boiled down to price. Comments are far too often knee-jerk reactions to pricing. And you know me, I openly agree that branding makes up a huge piece of the cost of a luxury watch. I also openly agree that there are huge markups on some brands. But you know what's a problem? It's a problem when a brand like Anodain says they maximum charge, I think it's 3 times the manufacturing cost. Do you know why? Because any price increase for a feature gets questioned. People will think it's too expensive. They've raised prices. They've lost the plot. I mean, I spoke to a value brand a couple of months ago, and they're known for really good branding, and they want to launch something really cool with some cool complications, and they are terrified of doing it because people might not accept the pricing. Their markup isn't going to change. It would still be a 3x watch, but because it's a more complex watch, it would be a watch that was a lot more expensive than the people were used to, and they were worried that the price would be too far above what people were used to for the brand. But it's still only 3x. And they were considering not launching the product simply because they thought it would be too far ahead. Sometimes things cost more, and it's not always just price gouging and marketing. And, inflation is a thing. Brands do need to raise prices. And if we can't afford it, we can't afford it. But if we push too hard on pricing, do you know what ultimately happens? The brands don't make a profit, and then they go out of business, and we lose options. And this isn't a defense of, or an attack on capitalism. But I live in Denmark. And if you've ever been to a supermarket in Denmark, you'll know that the quality of a lot of groceries in Denmark is just terrible. And the reason is because a lot of Danes only care about the price. So it's a race to the bottom in terms of quality. I'd hate for that to happen in watches because it'll kill the industry and then it'll kill the hobby. Then there's the relationship between brands and YouTubers and other kinds of sites as well, like Herdinky and A Blog to Watch and that kind of stuff. Not so much about YouTube, but how YouTube content is processed. Tech, as I said before, has a sort of semi-symbiotic relationship with YouTubers. So ASUS and Intel send their products to YouTubers for reviews, and a lot of YouTubers do unbiased reviews. Those same YouTubers also do sponsored content with ASUS and Intel and other tech brands. So if you want knowledge about tech, YouTube is the place to go. End of story. It's the best consumer information space out there. This is accepted and understood to be the norm. Tech YouTubers have power over the brands, and as important, tech YouTubers are typically held to an incredibly high standard by other YouTubers and also consumers in terms of being clear about business deals and when something is an independent review and when something isn't. In the movie and entertainment industry, a similar thing is happening. There's a guy called the Critical Drinker and the Critical Gamer, and he had a super cool video a couple of weeks back called We're the Media Now. The broader narrative was that movie studios were dealing with the fact that independent reviewers were far more powerful these days than more established review sites like Kotaku and IGN and Eurogamer. The independence of these YouTubers is having a massive impact on the industry. The industry doesn't like it because these reviewers are not under the control of the studios, and they are therefore free to be as critical as they want. That's not fully the case in the watch world. Watch YouTube can't be like the movie and game review YouTube. Anyone can go into the cinema, watch a movie for a small amount, relatively speaking, of money, and voice their opinion. But there are not a lot of people that can buy every single watch out there that they want to review. The barrier to entry is in favor of brand control. Basically, if you want access to our watches, you need to be nice. It might not be an explicit demand, but it's implicitly there in the power dynamic. Now, right now, it's not the norm that brands send watches for free review, especially not the big brands. Rolex does not send watches, at least not to my knowledge, to any YouTuber. Neither does Omega. I think the Time and Tide guy does it, but that's because he has a shop that sells them. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have access. IWC, they don't release all watches to all reviewers. They've got a small group of people they have a commercial relationship with, where there's advertising and money being made on the one hand, and access to independent reviews on the other. Now, the same goes for a host of other brands. It's not particularly specific for IWC. Either they give no access or some level of explicit or implicitly contingent access. So like the drinker says, there's a symbiosis, but it's not conducive to truly independent reviews. That's not to say that there aren't independent reviewers out there. Also, there are brands that will send you a watch, insist that you send it back, and have no strings attached when it comes to what you want to say. Especially the smaller and more agile brands are happy to roll the dice and accept any potential risk of a negative review. Overall, though, the power balance between the YouTube space and the brands is still being shaped. What we've seen since COVID, especially small independent brands have been opening their doors, largely with no strings attached, simply because they don't have the marketing budgets to get talked about in any meaningful way. So rather be talked about and be heard potentially negatively than not be heard at all. Bigger brands, however, are still either reluctant to open the door or are still trying to exert control. On the other side of the coin, some YouTubers are open to accepting access contingent on some level of creative compromise. And, if that's a super convoluted way of saying it, but basically some big brands are happy to pay for press releases and some YouTubers are happy to release those press releases in return for early access and maybe a sponsorship deal, here and there. Some of the more jaded of you out there might feel that this has been going on forever, but it really hasn't. Not at this scale, and it is at a bit of a turning point. Simply put, people come to YouTube to learn about tech. They trust the YouTubers, and in turn, they buy and avoid products based on their recommendations. Importantly, both tech enthusiasts come to YouTube, but also new customers. As a result, I think the overall market grows because of a largely independent and trustworthy tech YouTube. Tech revenues benefit from an independent YouTube. The same goes for game and movie review YouTube. And, some movies will get a scathing review and they won't get watched, which is as it should be. But the reviews get viewers into movies that are good and streaming shows that are good, that are worth watching, and they push studios to make better content. This is all because of this healthy mix of access and independence. In the short term, a contingent relationship with brands helps the individual brand and also the individual YouTuber. But in the long term, I think the story is different. And just think of Hodinkee and the credibility of Hodinkee since they were at LVMH. No matter their efforts, they're not as regarded as a source of independent information anymore. And because they aren't, new buyers that want to be sure about their potential purchases can't get what they feel is trustworthy opinion. Some of them just won't buy. But you know what an independent YouTube community would do? That would grow the overall market because it becomes a trustworthy ground to explore a hobby and, one-off purchases. There's literally more money in independent YouTube for the brands than there is in a contingent YouTube. I also think that YouTube can be incredibly powerful and can force change and innovation into a fundamentally stuffy and almost xenophobic industry. I do think that JLC had to think twice about their pricing because primarily of the way YouTubers talked about their pricing. I do think that the conversations about Rolex's lack of availability has made its way to the Rolex boardroom. And that's not just YouTube, that's people in forums and Reddit and everywhere. I also know, and this is, I know that somebody at IWC watched my critique of IWC. Not to say that I'm a holder of truth in any way, but to say we are being listened to. And that's just not us on this side of the camera, it's also you on the other side when you voice it online. To me, being listened to and having a voice is more important than what money I can make on short-term deals with any given brands. But right now, I do think Watch YouTube is at a crossroads. Now, if you're interpreting this as saying you can't trust YouTubers, you're wrong. I think a large majority of YouTubers are independent, and when they aren't, they're relatively open about it. A lot like tech YouTube. But there's still a power and access imbalance, which to me means that some brands would like to continue to, if not control, then at least influence the narrative. And, they would throw enough money on the table and someone is going to say yes. Now, if you're a full-time YouTuber, that money is likely part of your business model. But your business model is very much also built on a foundation of credibility. The more commercialized the relationship gets, the more the credibility potentially erodes, and over time it erodes the potential power of YouTube and other social media as a source of entertainment, but also as a source of independent thought. There's absolutely nothing wrong with Brit Pierce getting money from Nomos to do a video where she says, I'm being paid, but I love their watches, and this is why. It's open, it's declared, it's fine. But if the brands want to leverage YouTube as a positive, they have to accept that YouTube might say something negative. In the long term, the broader community will grow as trust in YouTube and other channels grows as a medium of information and as a medium of independent opinion. That's my thinking, at least. There's nothing wrong with collaboration, but independence, separation, and retention of creative control is imperative, not just for YouTubers, but for the industry. Because when we talk about watches in an unaffected way, we don't just talk to enthusiasts. We talk to potential enthusiasts, new buyers, new customers, future enthusiasts. I think more people bought certain brands like Baltic because they had heard what they felt to be unbiased talk about them from YouTubers and Instagrammers and other people. Short version, brands have to accept that we will say whatever we want and that on the whole, it's going to benefit them more than hurt them. Anyway, I hope you don't think this was too much of a rant. I love watches. Hopefully you can tell that. I love sharing my hobby with you guys and I love what social media can do as a positive. I do just think it's important to consider the potential negatives of the way we approach things through social media. Our hobby won't thrive if we reduce it to specs. Our hobby doesn't benefit from reductive conclusions about Swiss made or Chinese made. Our passion dies if we reduce it to secondary pricing and value retention. We don't benefit as enthusiasts by organizing ourselves as lovers and haters, fors and againsts. YouTube and other mediums have to remain independent, and the more independent they are, the more powerful they will become as a medium. It doesn't have to be detached from the industry, but creative control is essential. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. They were just ramblings of a man with way too much time to overthink things and a huge passion for watches. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.